September 25, 1944. The rain fell in sheets across the bloated waters of the lower Rhine at Arnhem. Under the crackle of German machine gun fire, Captain William Harrington of the 23rd Field Company, Royal Engineers, could hear the wooden planks of the makeshift pontoon bridge groan beneath the weight of terrified civilians. Their faces, pale and drawn in the grey morning light, told a story of desperation as they shuffled across the fragile lifeline he and his men had constructed under impossible conditions. A Luftwaffe fighter screamed overhead, its black silhouette briefly visible against the leaden sky before it unleashed another barrage of bullets that ripped into the water just meters away, sending geysers of foam into the air. "Keep moving, keep your heads down," Harrington shouted, his voice nearly lost in the cacophony of battle. As another section of the bridge began to buckle, he raced toward the failing structure, the smell of cordite and river mud filling his nostrils. Through the fog of war, he glimpsed the faces of the Dutch civilians, old men clutching photographs, mothers with infants pressed to their chests, children wide-eyed with terror. Behind them, the German artillery had intensified, methodically destroying what remained of Arnhem's northern district. Harrington knew they had minutes, perhaps seconds, before the entire bridge collapsed, plunging dozens into the freezing current. No one in the Royal Engineers had predicted that one man's defiance of direct orders that morning would result in the salvation of over 300 civilians and wounded soldiers who had been given up for lost. As the bridge shuddered beneath another nearby explosion, Harrington locked eyes with his sergeant and nodded grimly. They would hold this position regardless of the cost. William Harrington was born on May 3, 1912, in the small mining town of Sedgefield, County Durham. The son of a colliery mechanic and a schoolteacher, his early years were shaped by the strict but loving home his parents created, despite the hardships of life in northern England between the wars. His father, James Harrington, had served in the Royal Engineers during the First World War, returning home with both a Distinguished Conduct Medal and a pronounced limp from a German shell at Passchendaele. The stories his father told, not of heroics, but of the quiet competence of the engineers who built bridges under fire and cleared paths through minefields, fired young William's imagination. "Engineers don't win medals for charging machine gun nests," his father would say, nursing a pint at their small kitchen table. "We win wars by building what needs building and blowing up what needs blowing up, always at the right time, always in the right place." William excelled at mathematics and physics in school, showing a particular aptitude for structural design. His teachers encouraged him to pursue higher education, a rarity for a boy from his background. In 1930, he secured a scholarship to study civil engineering at Durham University, becoming the first in his family to attend university. His mother, Elizabeth, had saved for years, putting aside a few shillings from her teacher's salary each month to help with his books and living expenses. When the Great Depression deepened and his father faced reduced hours at the colliery, William nearly abandoned his studies to help support the family. It was his father who insisted he continue. "This country will need builders after this depression ends," James told him, "and if the troubles in Europe turn to war, they'll need them even more." William graduated with honours in 1934 and joined a civil engineering firm in Newcastle, working primarily on bridge construction and repair. When tensions in Europe increased, he joined the Territorial Army, following in his father's footsteps by enlisting in the Royal Engineers. By 1939, as Hitler's armies marched into Poland, Lieutenant William Harrington was called to active duty and assigned to the 23rd Field Company of the Royal Engineers. His unit was initially tasked with constructing coastal defences along Britain's eastern shores, preparing for a German invasion that thankfully never materialised. His commanding officer, Major Lawrence Phillips, quickly recognized Harrington's exceptional understanding of load-bearing structures and his ability to improvise with limited materials, skills that would later prove invaluable. By 1943, Harrington had been promoted to captain and participated in the planning for the Allied invasion of Normandy, designing portable bridges and developing new techniques for rapid bridge repair under combat conditions. As the Allies pushed inland following D-Day, the 23rd Field Company followed, rebuilding crucial infrastructure destroyed by the retreating German forces. William earned a reputation for calm efficiency under fire. Harrington could build a bridge, while the devil himself was throwing brimstone, one of his men remarked. His unit suffered losses, of course. The engineers often worked exposed to enemy fire, but William's careful planning minimized casualties while maximizing results. By September 1944, Captain Harrington and his company had been attached to the British XXX Corps as part of Operation Market Garden, the ambitious Allied plan to secure bridges across the major waterways in the Netherlands and establish a foothold across the Rhine into Germany. None of them could have predicted how desperately their skills would soon be needed, nor the moral courage that would be required when orders and humanity collided on the banks of the lower Rhine. The Allies' bold plan for Operation Market Garden represented one of the most ambitious airborne operations in military history. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had conceived a daring strategy. 3 airborne divisions would be dropped behind enemy lines to secure a corridor over 60 miles long, capturing and holding key bridges until ground forces could relieve them. The British 1st Airborne Division, along with the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, were assigned the northernmost and most difficult objective, the bridges at Arnhem spanning the Lower Rhine. On September 17, 1944, thousands of British paratroopers descended from the skies over the Dutch countryside. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost and approximately 740 men of the 2nd Parachute Battalion managed to reach the northern end of the main road bridge at Arnhem. However, the remainder of the division, dropped miles from their objectives, encountered unexpected resistance from elements of the German 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions that were refitting in the area. The British forces established a defensive perimeter in the suburb of Oosterbeek, but without the anticipated rapid relief from XXX Corps, their situation grew increasingly desperate. By September 21st, Frost's men at the bridge had been overwhelmed after a heroic 4-day stand. The remaining British and Polish forces were compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter around the Hartenstein Hotel in Oosterbeek, subjected to intense artillery bombardment and infantry attacks from all sides. Captain Harrington's 23rd Field Company had advanced with the leading elements of XXX Corps, fighting their way up what the troops grimly called Hell's Highway, the single narrow road upon which the entire operation depended. Their progress was slowed by fierce German resistance, destroyed bridges, and traffic congestion. By September 24th, they had reached the south bank of the Lower Rhine at Driel, directly across from the beleaguered airborne forces. The original Market Garden plan was in tatters, and a new grim reality was setting in. The 1st Airborne Division would need to be evacuated rather than reinforced. Major General Roy Urquhart, commander of the 1st Airborne Division, radioed a stark assessment to headquarters. Situation critical, casualties very heavy, relief essential. With the main Arnhem Road Bridge firmly in German hands and no feasible way to establish a strong bridgehead across the Lower Rhine, the Allied High Command made the painful decision to withdraw the surviving airborne troops. The mission to execute this withdrawal fell to the Royal Engineers, including Harrington's 23rd Field Company. The geography of the battle zone presented enormous challenges. The Lower Rhine at Arnhem was approximately 400 yards wide with a strong current, its north bank dominated by German forces, the south bank held tenuously by Allied troops. Between the two armies lay not only the water, but also the desperate Dutch civilian population of Oosterbeek, caught in the crossfire of a battle that had reduced their homes to rubble. The formal evacuation plan, codenamed Operation Berlin, focused exclusively on retrieving military personnel. No provisions were made for the hundreds of Dutch civilians trapped in the Oosterbeek pocket, many of whom had sheltered wounded British soldiers in their cellars despite grave personal risk. As Harrington surveyed the river on that rainy September morning, he understood fully the deadly calculus of war that sometimes reduced human lives to statistical considerations. The official orders were clear. Evacuate only military personnel. Civilians would have to wait for the eventual liberation of the area. Yet as he watched elderly Dutch men helping wounded British paratroopers toward the river and saw families huddled in the ruins of what had once been peaceful homes, something in William Harrington rebelled against the cold mathematics of military necessity. As the first day of Operation Berlin drew to a close on September 25, 1944, the situation at the Lower Rhine had deteriorated dramatically. Under cover of darkness, Royal Engineers, including Captain Harrington's men, had ferried approximately 2,000 British and Polish troops across the river in small canvas and wooden boats. The evacuation was proceeding according to plan, but dawn would bring increased German observation and the likelihood of Luftwaffe attacks on the exposed rescue operations. During the night, a group of Dutch resistance fighters made contact with Harrington at his command post on the southern bank. Their leader, a schoolteacher named Jan Visser, explained that approximately 300 civilians, many elderly, wounded, or children, had gathered in the ruins of a church near the river's edge, hoping for evacuation. German troops had been systematically searching buildings in Oosterbeek, and there were reports of reprisals against Dutch families suspected of sheltering Allied soldiers. "They will not survive another day," Visser told Harrington. "The Germans know they have helped your wounded. They will be shot." Harrington immediately relayed this information to his superior, Major Lawrence Phillips, requesting permission to expand the evacuation to include the civilians. The response was swift and unequivocal. Negative. Military personnel only. Insufficient resources and time for civilians. Daylight will expose operation to enemy fire. Complete military evacuation as ordered. The logic was sound from a military perspective. Every civilian evacuated would mean one fewer soldier brought to safety. Moreover, civilian evacuations had not been planned for, and improvisation in the midst of such a delicate operation could jeopardize the entire effort. Yet Harrington found himself unable to accept this calculus. At approximately 0400 hours on September 26th, Harrington made the decision that would define the remainder of his life. He approached Sergeant Thomas Davies, his most trusted non-commissioned officer, and 5 other engineers who had worked closely with him throughout the campaign. "I'm going to bring those civilians out," he said simply. "I can't make this an order. Anyone who comes with me is disobeying direct instructions from headquarters. There will likely be consequences." Davies didn't hesitate. "Then we'd better get moving, sir. Dawn's not far off." Harrington's plan was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than use the precious boats needed for the military evacuation, they would construct a makeshift pontoon bridge using debris from destroyed buildings, empty fuel drums, and rubber rafts. The bridge wouldn't need to last long, just enough time to get the civilians across before daylight exposed them to German observation and fire. While the official evacuation continued downstream, Harrington and his small team worked feverishly through the remaining hours of darkness to create their improvised crossing. Using ropes salvaged from damaged gliders and engineering stakes driven into the riverbed, they anchored a floating pathway that stretched precariously across the dark waters. Sergeant Davies, who had been a carpenter before the war, ingeniously devised a system of rope handrails to help steady the civilians as they crossed. By 0530 hours, with the first grey light beginning to seep into the eastern sky, their makeshift bridge stretched across the lower Rhine, a fragile lifeline of hope. Jan Visser and his resistance fighters began guiding small groups of civilians toward the crossing point, elderly men supporting each other, mothers carrying infants, children clutching small bundles of possessions. They emerged like ghosts from the pre-dawn mist. Harrington positioned his men along the length of the pontoon bridge, ready to provide assistance and prevent the structure from becoming overloaded. The first group had barely reached the midpoint of the river when the distinctive scream of Luftwaffe aircraft shattered the morning calm. 2 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters had detected the movement on the river and swooped down to investigate. Machine gun fire strafed the water around the bridge, sending civilians dropping to their knees on the swaying structure. Harrington had anticipated this possibility. Before beginning the operation, he had coordinated with a British anti-aircraft battery on the southern bank. Now these guns opened fire, not with the expectation of downing the nimble fighters, but to force them to break off their attack runs and gain precious seconds for the civilians on the exposed bridge. As the German aircraft pulled up to avoid the anti-aircraft fire, Harrington shouted for the civilians to continue moving. "Keep going. Don't stop. The guns will keep them busy." The Luftwaffe pilots, however, were not easily deterred. Banking sharply, they came around for another pass, this time focusing their fire on the southern end of the bridge where it connected to the bank. Wood splintered, and several of the fuel drums used as flotation were punctured, causing that section of the bridge to begin sinking. Civilians still on the bridge cried out in terror as the structure tilted precariously. Without hesitation, Sergeant Davies and 2 other engineers rushed into the water, working to shore up the damaged section with debris and their own bodies, forming human pillars to keep the bridge level, while civilians continued to cross. Harrington, seeing that the fighters were circling for yet another attack run, made a critical decision. Racing to a nearby abandoned British anti-tank position, he found what he was looking for, a Piat projector infantry anti-tank with several bombs still in their casing. Though designed to penetrate armor rather than bring down aircraft, in the hands of a desperate man, it became an improvised anti-aircraft weapon. As the first Focke-Wulf began its diving run, Harrington took aim and fired. The bomb arced through the air, missing the aircraft, but exploding close enough to shower it with shrapnel. The German pilot, surprised by this unexpected ground fire, pulled away sharply. This momentary respite allowed more civilians to scramble across the bridge, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. German artillery, alerted to the evacuation, began dropping shells near the crossing point. One landed close to the northern end of the bridge, killing 2 Dutch civilians instantly and wounding several others. The pontoon structure, never designed to withstand such pressure, was beginning to break apart in multiple sections. Harrington ordered his men to begin reinforcing the bridge with anything they could find. Wooden doors taken from ruined buildings, parts of destroyed vehicles, even their own equipment. Sergeant Davies, showing extraordinary presence of mind, organized the civilians into smaller, more manageable groups to prevent too much weight being placed on any single section of the bridge. As the morning progressed, the situation grew increasingly desperate. German infantry had begun moving toward the northern bank, and snipers were targeting anyone they could see moving toward the makeshift bridge. The Luftwaffe fighters had been joined by a 3rd aircraft, and they continued to make strafing runs despite the danger from British anti-aircraft fire. It was during one such attack that the bridge suffered its most serious damage. A direct burst of machine gun fire tore through the central section, splitting the pontoon structure nearly in 2. About 20 civilians were on that section when it began to collapse, including an elderly woman and 3 young children. Without hesitation, Harrington plunged into the frigid water, swimming to the sinking section. Other engineers followed his example, forming a human chain to rescue those who had fallen into the river. The current was strong, the water numbingly cold. Harrington managed to reach a young boy of perhaps 8 years, who was struggling to stay afloat. Grabbing the child with one arm, he used his free hand to swim toward the southern bank, where other engineers were pulling people from the water. The German aircraft, perhaps sensing the vulnerability of those in the river, began targeting the swimmers. In what would later be described as one of the most remarkable acts of the entire operation, Sergeant Davies, who had already been wounded by shrapnel, seized a Bren gun from a nearby position and, standing fully exposed on the bank, provided covering fire against the attacking aircraft. His accurate bursts forced the Focke-Wulfs to break off their attack runs prematurely, saving countless lives in those critical moments. By mid-morning, the situation had reached its crisis point. The makeshift bridge had been damaged beyond repair, with only portions of it still connecting the banks. Approximately 230 civilians had made it across to the relative safety of the southern bank, but at least 70 remained stranded on the northern side. German forces were closing in, and it seemed the rescue operation would have to be abandoned. It was at this moment that Harrington demonstrated why his men would follow him regardless of orders. Gathering the remaining engineers, he outlined a final, desperate plan. They would use the few intact boats left from the military evacuation to create a floating bridge of small craft, a chain of boats stretched across the river, with men positioned in each to help civilians move from one to the next. "It's a gauntlet," he acknowledged grimly. "The German guns will target us the entire way, but it's the only chance those people have." One of the younger engineers, a lance corporal named Jenkins, voiced what they were all thinking. "Sir, headquarters explicitly ordered no boats to be diverted from the military evacuation." Harrington looked him directly in the eye. "I'm well aware of that, Corporal. I'll take full responsibility, but I won't leave those people to die when we have the means to save them." As the impromptu boat bridge was being assembled, The German artillery fire intensified. Shells crashed into the water around them, drenching the men with spray and threatening to overturn the small craft. On the northern bank, Jan Visser and his resistance fighters were engaged in a desperate holding action, using captured German weapons to keep enemy infantry at bay long enough for the final evacuation attempt. The first boat in the chain pushed off from the southern bank at approximately 1100 hours. Harrington himself took position in the lead vessel, knowing that the success or failure of this operation would rest squarely on his shoulders. The small craft moved painfully slowly against the current, each man straining at the oars while keeping as low as possible to present smaller targets for German snipers. Halfway across, disaster struck. A shell landed close enough to swamp two of the boats in the middle of the chain, throwing engineers and the few civilians they had already picked up into the churning water. The formation began to break apart as men struggled to rescue those who had fallen overboard while maintaining their positions against the current. It was in this moment of near failure that Captain William Harrington demonstrated the leadership that would later earn him the reluctant admiration of even those who sought to court-martial him. Standing upright in the bow of his boat, fully exposed to enemy fire, he shouted orders that cut through the chaos, reorganizing the scattered craft into a new formation that could continue the mission. A bullet from a German sniper grazed his left arm, tearing through his uniform and drawing blood. Harrington barely seemed to notice, his focus entirely on the civilians huddled on the northern bank and the men under his command struggling to reach them. By 1200 hours, the first civilians were being loaded into the boats for the perilous journey back across the river. German artillery had shifted focus to target the northern bank directly, perhaps hoping to prevent the evacuation through sheer firepower. The air was filled with the crash of exploding shells, the screams of the wounded, and the constant crack of small arms fire as resistance fighters and the few remaining British paratroopers provided covering fire from whatever protection they could find. In the midst of this inferno, acts of extraordinary courage became commonplace. Engineers dove into the water to rescue civilians whose boats had been hit. Wounded men refused evacuation, insisting that the limited space be given to Dutch children and the elderly. Sergeant Davies, already injured and having lost a significant amount of blood, continued to coordinate the loading of boats until he collapsed from exhaustion and was forcibly evacuated by his comrades. By 1400 hours, the last boat was pushing away from the northern bank. Captain Harrington, who had crossed and recrossed the river 3 times during the operation, was helping an elderly Dutchman with a broken leg into the final craft when a massive artillery barrage began landing around them. A shell exploded in the water nearby, showering them with debris and nearly capsizing the overloaded boat. As they struggled to stabilize the craft, German infantry appeared at the top of the riverbank, firing down at the exposed evacuation party. It seemed that their luck had finally run out. Then, in what many would later describe as miraculous timing, 4 RAF Typhoon fighter bombers appeared overhead, responding to an earlier request for air support that had seemingly been forgotten in the confusion of battle. The Typhoons swept down on the German positions, machine guns chattering and rockets slamming into the artillery emplacements that had been making the evacuation so perilous. This unexpected air support provided just enough of a diversion for the final boats to push off into the current and begin their journey to the southern bank. The last crossing was perhaps the most dangerous of all. With their element of surprise long gone, and German forces fully aware of the evacuation, every weapon within range seemed to be directed at the small boats struggling across the water. Harrington, positioned in the stern of the final vessel, used his own body to shield a Dutch mother and her infant daughter from incoming fire. A bullet struck him in the shoulder, spinning him partially around but failing to dislodge him from his protective position. One of his engineers called out to him in alarm, but Harrington merely grimaced through the pain. "Keep rowing," he ordered. "We're almost there." At approximately 1430 hours, the last boat touched the southern bank. Hands reached out to help the final civilians ashore, pulling them up the muddy embankment toward medical stations that had been hastily established in anticipation of their arrival. Captain William Harrington was among the last to leave the boat, stepping onto the shore before collapsing from blood loss and exhaustion. In total, the unauthorized evacuation had rescued 302 Dutch civilians from certain capture or death. The cost had been significant. 4 engineers killed, 11 wounded, including Harrington and Davies. Nearly all the boats used in the operation had been damaged beyond repair, and precious time and resources had been diverted from the main military evacuation. Word of Harrington's actions reached headquarters within hours. Major General Urquhart, commander of the 1st Airborne Division, was reportedly furious at the diversion of resources during such a critical operation. Orders were immediately issued for Captain Harrington's arrest pending court-martial proceedings for direct disobedience of orders in a combat zone, an offence potentially punishable by execution under the extreme circumstances of war. Yet even as military policemen were dispatched to take Harrington into custody, accounts of what had transpired at the river were spreading among both military personnel and the rescued Dutch civilians. By evening, the full scope of what Harrington and his men had accomplished was becoming clear, and with it came a growing sense of admiration, even among those tasked with enforcing military discipline. Major Lawrence Phillips, Harrington's immediate superior, who had relayed the original orders forbidding civilian evacuation, found himself in the difficult position of having to arrest an officer whose actions, while clearly insubordinate, had saved hundreds of lives. Upon reaching the aid station where Harrington was being treated for his wounds, Phillips reportedly hesitated before ordering the arrest. According to witnesses, Harrington himself resolved the immediate dilemma. Despite his injuries, he struggled to his feet when Phillips entered the medical tent and said simply, "I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions, sir." Phillips, a veteran officer who had served in the First World War and understood the complex moral calculations of combat, looked at his wounded subordinate for a long moment before responding. "You'll face them, Captain. But not today. Today, we're still evacuating our people. Your skills are needed. Consider yourself under open arrest. Report to me when the operation concludes." This temporary reprieve allowed Harrington, once his wounds were treated, to continue assisting with the broader evacuation effort throughout the night of September 26th. By dawn on September 27th, Operation Berlin was complete. Over 7,000 Allied troops had been evacuated across the Lower Rhine, along with the 302 Dutch civilians saved by Harrington's unauthorized action. As the Allied forces withdrew to more defensible positions south of the river, the fate of Captain William Harrington remained uncertain. The charges against him were serious, and in the strict hierarchy of military command, his actions represented a dangerous precedent regardless of their humanitarian outcome. The military tribunal that convened on October 3, 1944, to consider Harrington's case faced an extraordinary dilemma. The facts were not in dispute. Harrington freely admitted to disobeying direct orders. Yet the outcome of his disobedience had been the rescue of 302 civilians who would almost certainly have faced death or internment at German hands. What complicated matters further was the public relations aspect of the case. Dutch civilians evacuated by Harrington's operation had spread the story throughout the liberated areas of the Netherlands. Several British war correspondents had picked up the account, and while military censors had prevented its publication, there was significant interest in what was already being called the miracle at Arnhem. The tribunal, consisting of 3 senior officers, heard testimony from both prosecution and defense over 2 days. The prosecution case was straightforward. Military discipline required obedience to orders, particularly in combat situations where the lives of many depended on the reliable execution of commands. The defense, while acknowledging the technical breach of orders, argued that Harrington's actions represented the highest ideals of British military tradition: courage, initiative, and humanity, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The most compelling testimony came from an unexpected quarter. Major General Roy Urquhart, whose initial anger had prompted the court-martial proceedings, appeared as a witness. Having had time to review the full circumstances and outcomes of Harrington's actions, Urquhart's perspective had evolved considerably. "In 40 years of military service," he told the tribunal, "I have seen men follow orders to the letter and achieve disaster. I have seen others use their judgment and achieve victory from certain defeat. Captain Harrington disobeyed a specific order, yes, but he upheld the fundamental purpose of our presence in Europe: to protect the innocent from tyranny. I cannot in good conscience condemn him for that. On October 5, 1944, the tribunal rendered its verdict. Captain William Harrington was found guilty of disobeying orders in a combat zone, a finding that was inevitable given his own admission. However, in an extraordinary decision, the tribunal recommended no punishment beyond a formal reprimand to be placed in his service record. The president of the tribunal, Colonel James Weatherby, explained their reasoning. Military discipline must be maintained, particularly in combat. Yet our regulations also recognize that officers must exercise judgment in extraordinary circumstances. Captain Harrington's actions, while technically in violation of specific orders, exemplified the courage and humanity that are the true foundation of military honor. His reprimand will stand as acknowledgement that orders must generally be obeyed, but his continued service will remind us all that our ultimate duty is to the principles for which we fight. Harrington returned to active duty with the 23rd Field Company, participating in the liberation of the Netherlands and the final push into Germany in 1945. His formal reprimand did not prevent his promotion to major before the end of the war, though it likely slowed his advancement compared to officers with similarly distinguished combat records. The true vindication of Harrington's decision at Arnhem came in the years following the war. Of the 302 Dutch civilians evacuated during his unauthorized operation, 297 survived the war. Many of these survivors and their descendants would later attest to the German reprisals that occurred in Oosterbeek following the Allied withdrawal, reprisals that almost certainly would have claimed their lives had they remained. Among those saved was 6-year-old Sophia van Leer, who had been carried across the river by Harrington himself after falling from the damaged pontoon bridge. 50 years later, at a commemoration ceremony in Arnhem, an elderly Sophia would present the former captain with a hand-carved wooden model of the makeshift bridge that had saved her life. "Some call it the bridge too far," she told assembled veterans and dignitaries, referencing the famous description of the Arnhem operation. But for us, it was the bridge just far enough. Perhaps the most significant long-term outcome of Harrington's actions was their influence on post-war military doctrine regarding civilian evacuations in combat zones. The Arnhem Principles, as they came to be known in military planning circles, established guidelines for incorporating humanitarian considerations into combat operations without compromising essential military objectives. After the war, William Harrington returned to civil engineering, specializing in bridge construction throughout the rebuilding of Europe. The firm he established would eventually help design and construct over 70 bridges across previously war-torn regions, including a permanent replacement for the Arnhem Road Bridge in 1948. He seldom spoke of his wartime experiences, and when pressed about the events at the Lower Rhine, would typically deflect with a modest, "We did what needed doing, that's all." Sergeant Thomas Davies, whose actions during the evacuation had been equally courageous, recovered from his wounds and remained lifelong friends with Harrington. The two men and their families would meet annually on the anniversary of the operation, a private commemoration that continued until Davies' death in 1983. Jan Visser, the Dutch resistance leader who had first approached Harrington about the stranded civilians, survived the war and later served as mayor of a small town near Arnhem. He maintained correspondence with Harrington for decades, and in 1964 successfully petitioned the Dutch government to award Harrington the Netherlands Cross of Merit, a rare honor for a foreign national. William Harrington passed away peacefully in his sleep on November 12, 1992, at the age of 80. His obituary in the Times made only brief mention of his wartime service, noting simply that he had participated in the Arnhem operation and received commendations for humanitarian actions. This understated description would have pleased him, colleagues noted, as he had never sought recognition for what he considered simply doing his duty as both a soldier and a human being. At his funeral, attended by engineering colleagues, family members, and a surprisingly large contingent of Dutch citizens, his son Michael shared a rare insight into his father's thinking about the events at Arnhem. Near the end of his life, I asked my father if he had ever regretted his decision to disobey orders and risk his career to save those civilians. He thought for a long moment before answering, The only thing I've ever regretted, he told me, is that we couldn't save more of them. The legacy of the Arnhem Bridge rescue extends far beyond the lives immediately saved. In military academies today, the case of Captain William Harrington is studied as an example of the complex moral calculations that combat leaders sometimes face, the tension between discipline and humanity, between following orders and following conscience. As Major General Sir Richard Gale would later write in his memoirs, war presents us with impossible choices, where every option carries a cost in human lives. What distinguished Harrington at Arnhem was not merely his courage under fire, which many demonstrated, but his refusal to accept that military necessity required abandoning innocent civilians to their fate. He reminds us that even in our darkest hours, we must not surrender the humanity for which we fight. The small monument that now stands near the southern bank of the Rhine bears no grand inscriptions, no heroic statuary. It is a simple stone bridge, perhaps 10 feet long, crossing a narrow ornamental stream in a peaceful park. Embedded in the stone is a bronze plaque with words in both English and Dutch, for those who built bridges when others would have burnt them. September 26, 1944. Each year on the anniversary of the evacuation, Dutch schoolchildren place flowers on this monument, many of them descendants of those who crossed the real bridge under fire so many decades ago. They are taught that sometimes the greatest courage is not found in following orders, but in recognizing when humanity demands more. The improvised pontoon bridge at Arnhem lasted less than 12 hours before being destroyed by German artillery. The lives it saved have lasted generations. As we consider the moral complexities of war, we might ask ourselves, what would we have done in Captain Harrington's position? Would we have had the courage to risk everything for strangers caught in the crossfire of history? Would we recognize that moment when duty to humanity transcends duty to command? In that rain-swept September dawn on the banks of the lower Rhine, one man made his choice. The bridge he built was temporary, but its legacy endures, a reminder that even in our darkest hours, individual courage and compassion can illuminate the path forward. Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means.